What's going on, everybody? Kevin from Storytellers Union here, one last time to round out my discussion on the top 30 albums of 2023. If you haven't caught the first three videos in this series, I'd highly recommend you do that before watching this. You can catch up on my honorable mentions as well as albums number 30 through 11. But without further ado, this is the cream of the crop. Let's just jump right now into the top 10 best albums of this past year. Beginning with number 10, Robert Finley, Black Bayou. Like many, I became acquainted with Robert Finley primarily through his association with the Black Keys and Dan Auerbach, who produces here. Once again, this is the third time he has produced Robert Finley. I guess it was the second album that Robert did with Dan where I really got on board. That's when I saw Robert on CBS Saturday Morning, and the performance was captivating, but so was his story that they told. He's now 69. He is a former Army veteran. He's also a former street musician who gave up carpentry and because of being declared legally blind. Didn't have his first record out till 2016, so later in his life. If all of that isn't a bluesman origin story, I don't know what is. But don't dismiss Robert Finley as being just clever marketing, a backstory, or even his superstar associations with the Black Keys. He is on my albums of the year list because of the fiery storyteller that he is, the raw gifts and vocals that he brings to this very authentic gospel, blues, and soul blend. Black Bayou, I think it's career best work for him. My number 10 album of the year. Number 9 is one of my more surprising albums to make my list, I do believe, despite the fact that it's probably the largest name of anyone on my list, that being the Rolling Stones and Hackney Diamonds. Who saw this coming? Not me. Obviously, the Rolling Stones are legends. They have really been a money printing machine that for decades have pretty well just been a live act living off their considerable legacy. And that's not dismissing the fact they're still a great live band and those hits still sound great. But as far as original material that would live up to anything they had done in the past, they didn't even seem interested in doing so. Whenever a new album would come out, it at best seemed an excuse to tour. And the further apart those albums became, the less likely it started to seem that they would ever do anything again. In fact, it's been nearly 20 years since they released an album of all new material. And it's been 40 years since they released an album this good. When I first heard the opening single, Angry, I thought to myself, this is their sharpest riff since Start Me Up all the way back in 1981. Again, 40 years ago. It was on the album Tattoo You, and I'm just going to go ahead and say it now. This is not just the first original album of new material from the Stones in 20 years. It is their best new material in that 40 years since Start Me Up and Tattoo You. That's right. And who could have guessed that would occur from a bunch of 80-year-olds who, in the interim, have lost one of their founding members, and yet they come out of this kicking and inspired. I don't know if it was that realization that time was finite that they got them into gear. It should be noted that though Charlie Watts did pass away, this album has been long gestating, so there are several of the tracks that he does appear on, and even Bill Wyman, the founding bassist and ex-member, returned just to play as part of the old rhythm section on a song here. There is other notable guest turns as well from superstars like Paul McCartney, Elton John, Stevie Wonder, a wonderful mostly closing number. There's a little bonus track at the end, but a duet with Lady Gaga. Again, superstar level stuff here when it comes to the cameos, but it really is the Stones themselves that steal the show. If this does end up being the last original work of the group, it is a worthy capper that recaptures their swagger and their riffs and puts it in a modern context to sort of tie a bow on what has to be one of the more legendary careers in the history of rock and roll, and great to see the boys back in fine form. The Rolling Stones, Hackney Diamonds. Number 8 album of the year for me is Devin Gilfillian's Love You Anyway. This is Devin's sophomore album, and the first release that he had was very promising. Very much enjoyed that as well. But this is a leap forward. You you got a person here who writes in the soul and R&B uh, traditions, I guess you'd say, of 60s and 70s, classic soul and R&B music, but it's not beholden to it at all. In fact, Devin will, alongside of tracks that feature live rhythms with bass and drums, the, comfortably alongside of 808s and samples, and never does that feel like it's not meshing together. In fact, it congeals very nicely as a whole. And much the way that he can show that kind of versatility with his production and stylistic choices, he does the same thing with his subject matter as well. He can, there's a lot of love songs on this album, as the title track, the title there of the album would suggest, but he mixes in with, much tougher topics such as voter suppression, for example. So he doesn't shy away from the political and manages to find a way to marry that with the personal, much like his hero, Marvin Gaye, used to do. And I point out Marvin Gaye because, he recently, Devin did a entire note by note cover of Gaye's classic What's Going On album to just make that hero worship even clearer. I do believe that a modern Gaye would very much appreciate the work of Devin Gafillion and what he has accomplished here with Love You Anyway. I would draw special attention to that title track, one of my favorite songs of all of 2023. It is a lump in your throat gospel declaration to love, even in the face of hate. And I think it's a message that the world needs to hear. I can't get through it without getting misty eyed. I will put in a caveat here that as great as the album is, I think I had it rise in my personal esteem when I saw him at Bonnaroo over the summer. I had the privilege of doing so with my cousin, and Devin put on one of the best acts, best shows of the whole weekend, even though he was surrounded by much larger names, way higher up on that poster than he was. He put on one of the weekend's best sets. Devin Gafillion, a talent to watch here on his second album of original material, Love You Anyway. He knocks it out of the park. Check it out. Number 7. Dear Tick, Emotional Contracts. So before I talk about the album itself, I get asked a lot, actually, especially since I started doing this video series. I've had a few people ask if I collect physical media or if I stream all of my choices. And honestly, I'm not a purist either way. I do both. Both for the sake of the space in my house as well as financial considerations. I can't purchase everything that I want to listen to. In fact, when I began to accumulate this list to try to narrow down, I had 60 some albums I was considering. So I had almost cut it in half just to get it manageable. So I'd listened to a lot of music. That said, I do like to take certain things and certain albums that mean something to me, certain pieces that I want to have as part of a collection. And I do, when I can, try to support those artists by also purchasing the vinyl. As is the case here with Dear Tick, I got Emotional Contracts. I have it on this beautiful candy apple red. It's got the black swirl. Really happy to have this version of the album. So for the album itself, I would say that it's a loose concept record, and I say very loose concept record. You don't have to know that to appreciate it, but the through line tying these songs together is Emotional Contract. Each of these songs represents an emotion, a bargain, a deal one makes with oneself. These are compromises that would be familiar to any of us who have lived long enough in the adult world. The more we age, the more of these compromises we have to make with ourselves. And it's the reality. And it's a unifying element that really elevates this album, in my opinion, makes it really unique. Again, you don't need to know that. The songs stand on their own. But I thought it was kind of an interesting thing that they've attempted here. they've been indie rock stalwarts for a while now. I've been a fan of Deer Tick for a long while now, but I've never loved an album of theirs quite like I love this one. I think it's really telling that a band that's more than 20 years into their career, that they can produce what, in my mind, is career best work. It sounds both retro and of the present. In fact, it a little bit sounds out of time. And in that regard, they remind me at times, again, this is high praise, and I don't mean to put them in the category of legends yet, but the band was that way. The band were both in step, with the 60s, even though the music they were creating sounded timeless and like nothing else that was happening in that era. And that's kind of where Deer Tick is now. This can be both retro or it could be, recorded today, which this was. I think that's a compliment to the work that they've done here. In fact, I think that even on some of the ballads, they even sound a little bit like the band. But there is a nice mix of ballads and rockers here. On the ballad side, A Light Goes Out in the Heart is as good a song as anyone put on record this past year. It's now my favorite Deer Tick ballad by far. On the other side of that coin, If She Could Only See Me Now is a rocking earworm that you will not get out of your head. I'd say that about all of Emotional Contracts, an album worth the attention and worthy of a number 7 spot on my best albums of 2023 list. Moving on to number 6, Sufjan Stevens, Javelin. So marrying the tenderness of the emotionally naked beauty of Carrie and Lowell with the electrical pulse of Age of Adz, Sufjan has managed to take both sides of his sort of split personality and combine them into an expert whole that doesn't show its seams. He's usually worked in 2 veins. You either have that folky, beautiful side of him, or you get the experimental kitchen sink side of him. Here you get both, and it works to perfection. It's prime Stevens. I would say that there's heartbreak, but it's also a hopeful record, sort of an equal measure. The arrangements themselves are definitely ornate. They're gorgeous, they're Baroque, but they don't overwhelm the very tender, vulnerable singing that Sufjan does as well. I don't know that anyone provides a more honest feeling vocal that Sufjan Stevens has managed to do throughout his career, and especially apparent here on Javelin, just as it was on Carrie and Lowell. There are times you can almost hear the sound of his heart breaking, or you can hear the honest emotions that he is trying to get across on a song like Will Anybody Ever Love Me, where it seems such a simple question, but it is asked in such a honest and again, vulnerable type way that it's hard to resist. One of the year's best albums for sure. Will Anybody Ever Love Me? One of the best songs of the year. Sufjan Stevens' Javelin, a worthy addition to his formal catalog. Clocking in at number 5, halfway through the top 10 here, it's the War and Treaty with Lover's Game. War and Treaty became one of my favorite acts to see live. Part of the reason they're so wonderful to see live, if any of you ever have, is due in great part to just the onstage chemistry and an obvious love between the husband and wife duo of Michael and Tanya Trotter. They obviously have this deep affection for one another. They also have a beautiful backstory. I would implore you to seek out to learn how they became a couple. It's oft repeated, so I will not do so here. I think I have stated it a few times over the last few of these lists whenever they've made one. But it's just safe to say that they have been through some stuff to come out the other side whole, a couple. Strong in each other and in each other's love, and all of that pours into their live show. And then for me, I think this is the first time that they fully captured that feeling on record. They have done some great work previously, some songs that I've really loved, some strong albums, but this is a next level ode of both vulnerability and hope. At times, I think Michael's vocals sound, when he goes in that lower register, he can put you in the mind of like Ray Charles. Of course, he also has this soaring falsetto, while Angela has this powerhouse voice. When they meld together, it is particularly affecting. It is a tower to the gospel heavens. The paint peels from the walls. You're taken to church, and you just want to throw your hands in the air. Last year, they made my honorable mentions list with their Blank Page EP. At the time when I was reviewing it here in our video, I said that if the album that will follow this is anywhere like this, they're going to deliver us a classic. Most of the Blank Page EP is represented here. The songs they surrounded it with are equally as strong as that. So yes, classic delivered. The War on Treaty, Lover's Game, number 5 on my list of best albums of the year. Moving on to number 4, we got The National, First Two Pages of Frankenstein, which I also picked up on candy apple red vinyl. Beautiful piece of art in and of itself. Also a beautiful piece of art is the album contained within. It's been 5 years since the National last had an album. And when they returned with First Two Pages of Frankenstein, it was the longest lapse between recorded work that the band had done, but they'd all been busy. I'll get to a little bit of that in a minute, because I think the busyness has helped them. It's not, though, just those side projects that had caused the delay. Lead singer and lyricist Matt Berninger had said that he just didn't have his writing chops down for the longest time. He had done a solo album in the interim of the National going and doing their own things there for a little while. And when they regrouped, he just experienced writer's block like he had never done before. But in addition to First Two Pages of Frankenstein, they surprise released a couple months later a completely new album that is sort of the sister record to this, Laugh Track, also worthy. I'll say you can group these two together. But it's safe to say, with that sudden glut of new material, that whatever writer's block Matt was experiencing is a thing of the past. Thank goodness, especially when you consider how strong both of these records are. Again, I think the previously mentioned side projects has actually been part of what made this album so great to me, because I think that as each of these members have drifted off, done their own things, they brought the lessons learned back into the band environment, and that's benefited the what you hear here on First Two Pages of Frankenstein. Bryce Dessner, for example, has been living in France, working on film scores, classical compositions. You hear that. You hear the classical influences and the expansive arrangements. And then his twin brother and guitarist, Aaron Dessner, he's worked with a sort of an obscure act over the last few years, producing and writing with her. You may have heard of her, Taylor Swift. And what that has brought to the proceedings is, well, it brought Taylor Swift. Taylor actually does a cameo. Hopefully, because of her superstar influence, this will get the National heard by more ears. But her duet with Berninger on the Alcott is one of the highlights of an album that has many highlights. Swift isn't the only cameo. The aforementioned Sufjan Stevens, who clocked in a couple of numbers back there, he appears on the opening track. And then indie rock it girl Phoebe Bridgers, she is on 2 of these tracks, and absolutely worth a listen and worthy of making my top 5. Coming in at number 4, the National's First Two Pages of Frankenstein. In my mind, their best work in a decade, since 2013's Trouble Will Find Me. Speaking of doing best work in a decade, go back to that 2013 and you'll find the classic album Southeastern by Jason Isbell. Jason Isbell and the 400 Unit have clocked in here at number 3 with Weather Vanes. And in my mind, this is their best album since Southeastern. And the albums in between have been great as well. He is just not been fallible since he came forward with Southeastern. That work was produced by Dave Cobb, and Dave Cobb has worked with Isbell on every album since. It has propelled both of them, both artist and producer, to the top of their respective fields, and also helped to champion what had become known as the new Nashville sound. That's how influential Southeastern was as a record, and this partnership was, and that others began to use Cobb, others began to emulate the sound. It's a very more traditional sound while having this live in the room sort of feel to it. And you'd think after such a fruitful collaboration that you wouldn't fix what isn't broken, but Isbell decides to go it alone here for the first time in a decade. So he self-produced, and I thought that was a bit of a surprising choice. And I didn't need to worry, of course. When I heard the final product, you realize that Isbell has very much learned the lessons of working with Cobb. There's still that live in the room feel to the album and the production, but you can definitely tell the production choices has changed some things. Primarily, what it's changed is that Jason, more so than Cobb, will allow an expansion of the sound here. Songs drift on longer than they normally would. You could even say it's almost jammy. He does this to really highlight the interplay and the musicianship of the 400 unit. This is definitely a 400 unit focused album. You could say that it's even maybe a classic rock record. It's 13 tracks. It goes over an hour, and it sounds like Southern rock. It's the most rocking thing that Isbell has definitely been associated with since his days as a member of the Drive-By Truckers. And that alone, it makes it worth hearing. But if you're fearful that means that he has given up on his story songs, never fear. One of the greatest songwriters of this or any generation continues to show that sharp focus. That's very evident on tracks like King of Oklahoma, Cast Iron Skillet, and then the song he wrote about his strained relationship with the late, great Justintown Earl, tribute When We Were Close. Definitely a good mix of the classic Jason sound with the possibility of heading into some new directions that'll be interesting to see them explore. My number 3 album of the year, Jason Isbell, and the 400 unit with Weather Vanes. Coming in at number 2, the Mountain Goats, Jenny from Thebes. I'm lucky to have this one as well on vinyl, on the pink, on the peak yellow and black swirl. I hate that I missed out. There was a band exclusive vinyl that I think it was a marbled vinyl that sold out very quickly. I was too late to jump on that, and I'm kicking myself over it, but happy to have the beautiful indie variety there. You can get that at your local independent record store. But the Mountain Goats rarely let anyone down, and they haven't again here. Jenny from Thebes is the spiritual sequel, at least, to the Mountain Goats' classic album, All Hail West Texas. That album is nearing 20 years old at this point, came out in 2002, and it was a dividing line in the Mountain Goats' career through the 90s and the early 2000s. It had really been John Darnielle who was going by the name the Mountain Goats, but he was a solo act, putting out countless numbers of cassettes that he was recording on a Panasonic boombox. It had a particular feel and sound. The amateur do-it-yourself sound was very appealing and very urgent sounding, and that was the sound of All Hail West Texas, which was the final record that was recorded during that era before Mountain Goats became a full band, got themselves on a label, got themselves into a studio, and then over the years have continued to evolve into indie rock royalty at this point. So I guess the first thing you would question is why now? You know, that's a long period of time between albums if you're going to do a sequel. But Jenny hasn't been absent during those 20 years. Jenny has appeared occasionally throughout the repertoire of the Mountain Goats, sometimes obvious, sometimes maybe not so obvious. but she has been a through line to some of that older material. But here she is the central focus of the entire album. And you'll notice from note one that this is not a boombox recording. It could not be more different than the album of which it is an intended sequel. And that's probably a good thing. I don't know that if you could try to catch that lightning in a bottle again, that it would serve you well. This is the most produced album of the considerable Mountain Goats catalog. So that says quite a lot. But I do think it goes to highlight that John is perhaps underrated as an arranger. There are a lot of instruments here. This is not a four-piece rock and roll band album. There is many moving parts to it, all beautifully arranged and everything in its place. A far cry from the background noise and tape hiss of All Hell West Texas. But it is still a sequel. What we have is the story of Jenny continued from that time. And there is a murder mystery at the center of this. Jenny's always been a bit of a mysterious character, one that John himself has described as more notable by her absence than her presence. And if that's not cryptic enough, Mountain Goat fans are obsessive. So at this point, with the new album, the old album, the tracks in between that are obviously about Jenny, maybe a few that could be about Jenny, it's all caused folks to head to the intranet and start wikis and discussions. And there's a whole group of people that's diving into the mystery of this, trying to connect all the dots, which John does not do for you. But if all of that complication sounds like the work of an author more than a songwriter, that's because John is also a renowned and award-winning novelist. And so him coming up with a musical crime fiction, as it were, is not a surprise. And it works on so many levels. But do not be intimidated to think that you need to have any familiarity with the backstory or any familiarity even with the Mountain Goats in order to crack into the world of Jenny from Thebes. Unlike most concept albums, it is thankfully brief. And it doesn't get convoluted. You can enjoy the songs on their surface value. In fact, I would say that opening track Clean Slate and Fresh Tattoo are as good as anything in the entire Mountain Goats catalog, which says a lot. I think these will be songs that'll be towards the end of the set or in the encore of Mountain Goats shows for years to come. That's just how good they are. And that's just how consistent, honestly, the Mountain Goats have been. In fact, it's the second straight year of the band coming in my top 10. And considering how prolific and consistent John Darnielle is, wouldn't discount them returning for a three-peat in 2024. That leads us to a drum roll. Thank you. And my album of the year coming in at number one, Boy Genius, the record. When Boy Genius first came about in 2018 is when they released an EP. It was easy to think at the time that this was just a brief, a minor project from three singer-songwriters, Julian Baker, Phoebe Bridgers, and Lucy Dacus, excuse me. They had become friends, were fans of each other's work, so they did a brief 4-song EP. Again, kind of minor, well-received. They all move on. They all, from that moment, go on to have even bigger careers than they'd had at that moment. So Bridgers especially had saw her star really rise. So considering that level of fame that they had attained in the interim, it was quite a surprise to find that the group had secretly been recording a full album together. And it was even greater surprise when we finally heard that full album. Of course, again, my album of the year, you'd certainly want to have as part of your collection. I have it on the clear vinyl, which sounds wonderful. But the album itself probably took some people by surprise because like an indie folk Voltron, we have these three talented people coming together and managing to produce something that's even greater than the sum of its parts. And those parts are considerably talented. Most supergroups tend to be either enjoyable or just curiosities. And instead, what you get with the record is best work of any of these young artists' careers. So yes, we were maybe unprepared for the record, but it's been unescapable since. It's topped the charts in many countries. They have appeared on SNL. They have been on album covers. They have ended up with 6 Grammy nominations, including one for Album of the Year. It's just been that rare phenomenon where critics and consumers are in agreement as to the talent on display with the record. And to that end, it kind of surprising to see that here towards the end of the year, you started to see a few skeptics for the first time. And I think as much as anything, it's just Boy Genius fatigue because it was their world this year. We were just living in it. Um, I guess on the good end, you could say it maybe was some fatigue. On the negative end, it's very likely that it's also rooted somewhat in sexism and homophobia. The 3 ladies who comprise Boy Genius identify as queer. They are also strongly feminist in their message. They have a very female audience. When I saw Phoebe solo, it was probably 80-20% female to male, which is fantastic. Representation is important. And I think that hearing these voices that maybe have not been able to have the spotlight that they've deserved for the longest time is a great thing for everyone. But take all of that aside. You don't have to know anything about their personal lives and all that they've come to represent, because the truth is that they have come to represent more than just a band and just this album. There is a community that's grown up around them because of that representation. Again, I think that's wonderful and important. What happens though when you see something that beautiful come together, there always ends up being that rare element of gatekeepers who decide who can and can't be a fan, and then the doubters who want to poke holes in anything good by claiming that the women's backstory here is part of why they are supposedly unassailable, and you can't say anything negative about Boy Genius. I'd argue that anyone should be a Boy Genius fan, and that this music should speak to anyone who loves honest art. And you don't have to know anything about the band, again, to enjoy this album. Put the needle on the record, and the joy and the affection these women have for one another just pours from the grooves. The catchiness of this indie pop, rock, and folk is simply undeniable. It is music of the highest order. When I first heard a single for this in January, I thought this could potentially be the album of the year if the rest of the album lives up to the early releases. Come March, that album came out, and I knew right then and there it would be hard to see anyone beating this album as far as quality goes for the rest of 2023. Guess what? No one did. They even did a victory lap. Also worth hearing. Pick up the rest, late in the year EP that is worthy of its mothership, and that is the record by Boy Genius. Undeniable, unassailable, absolutely 2023's album of the year. Pick that up. Pick any of the other 29 or my honorable mentions up. I appreciate you watching. If you've watched it all the way to this point, I want to know what you think, what you feel about my selections. Tell me which ones I have missed. I know that there's only so much time, but there is so much music. I want to know what you were listening to in 2023 and what I need to go catch up on. I appreciate your support. If you can, if you've liked any of this, you can show that support by giving us a like or a follow. My band Storytellers Union is working on our 3rd album. We appreciate any support you give us, especially those likes and follows. I appreciate you watching this list and letting me know what you think. Thank you once again, and I will do this again in 2024. I hope to see you then.